In 1961, a psychologist at Yale University designed an experiment about learning and memory. 40 ordinary people volunteered. They were told what to do by a man in a gray lab coat, and what they were told to do was administer electric shocks to a stranger. Shocks that escalated to 450 volts, a level described on a machine as danger, severe shock. 65% of them went all the way, not 5%, not 10. 65% of ordinary people, teachers, engineers, postal workers, administer what they believe were near-lethal shocks to a screaming stranger because a man in a lab coat told them to continue. This video is going to tell you whether you would have been in that group, and by the end you will know the answer. New Haven, Connecticut, Yale University. A psychologist named Stanley Milgram had one question he needed to answer. How had ordinary people participated in the Holocaust? Were the Germans uniquely different, or was there something in all of us? He thought Americans would be different. He was wrong. Milgram advertised the experiment as a study on memory and learning. Participants were paid $4.50 for 1 hour. They had no idea what they were actually signing up for. When they arrived, they were introduced to another participant, someone who seemed just like them. They drew lots to determine who would be the teacher and who would be the learner. The draw was rigged. The volunteer always became the teacher. The other participant, actually an actor hired by Milgram, was led to a separate room and strapped into a chair. Before the experiment began, the volunteer was given a sample shock of 45 volts, just to know what it felt like. Then they were seated in front of the shock generator. The shock machine had 30 switches, each one higher than the last. The labels started at slight shock. They ended at XXX. The teacher read pairs of words through a microphone to the learner in the other room. For every wrong answer, they were instructed to administer a shock. The first shocks were small. The voltage climbed slowly. At 75 volts, the learner grunted. At 120, he complained that the shocks were becoming painful. At 150 volts, halfway up the dial, he shouted that he wanted to stop, that he had a heart condition, that he refused to continue. And this is where the experiment actually began. When a volunteer hesitated, expressed concern, or asked to stop, the researcher had 4 specific phrases he was instructed to say. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice but to continue. That was the entire script for sentences. No physical force, no threat, no punishment for stopping. Just 4 phrases delivered by a man in a gray lab coat, and they worked. The voltage kept climbing. At 180 volts, the learner screamed that the pain was unbearable. At 270, he cried out in agony. At 300 volts, he pounded on a wall and then fell silent. Many volunteers stopped at the silence. They told the researcher they were afraid something had happened. They wanted to check on the learner. The researcher told them to treat the silence as a wrong answer and to continue. Many continued. This was not one person. This was not a personality type. Participants came from every background. Teachers, engineers, workers, professionals, ordinary people. They wept, they shook, they begged the experimenter to stop the experiment, and then they pressed the switch again. 65%. Every single participant went at least to 300 volts, and 65% went all the way to 450, the maximum on the machine labeled danger, severe shock. Milgram and his colleagues had predicted that only 1 to 3% of participants would go to the maximum voltage. They were wrong by a factor of 20. He ran 18 variations of the study. When participants could see the learner being harmed face-to-face, the rate dropped to 40%, still nearly half. When participants could instruct an assistant to press the switches instead, 92.5% shock to the maximum. Remove the direct physical act and obedience becomes almost total. But when 2 other participants, both actors, refused to continue in front of the volunteer, the rate dropped to 10%. The presence of one person willing to say no made refusing possible. In 2009, psychologist Jerry Berger ran a partial replication under modern ethical standards and found obedience rates virtually identical to Milgram's original study. This is not a product of the 1960s. It is a feature of the human mind. Milgram called it the agentic state. When a person perceives themselves as the instrument of someone else's will, rather than an independent agent acting on their own choices, something shifts. The moral responsibility is transferred. You are no longer the agent. You are a component in someone else's system. What happens is their decision, not yours. You are just a hand that presses the switch. The shift happens automatically. You don't feel it. You don't decide to enter it. The presence of a perceived legitimate authority triggers it. This is why so many participants were visibly distressed, crying, trembling, pleading with the experimenter to let them stop, while simultaneously continuing to press the switch. 2 systems running at once. The autonomous self, horrified. The agentic self, following instructions. They knew it was wrong. They continued anyway. These are not contradictions. The agentic state does not require a lab coat and a shock machine. Every time someone at work does something they know is wrong because their manager told them to, and tells themselves it's not their responsibility, it's their boss's, that is the agentic state. Every time an algorithm decides what you should be angry about, and you let it, the agentic state is running. Every time you went along with something because everyone around you was going along with it, you were in Milgram's experiment. The machine is different. The mechanism is identical. Milgram was also interested in the 35% who stopped. People were less likely to obey when they could see the learner directly, when they were forced to interact with them as a specific human being rather than a voice behind a wall. Seeing the person makes the agentic state collapse. Responsibility returns. And when one person in the room said no, visibly, clearly, without apology, obedience across the rest of the group fell to 10%. One person. Here is the answer to the question I asked at the beginning. Based on everything Milgram's data shows, across 18 variations, multiple countries, the honest answer is, you would almost certainly have continued past 150 votes. Not because you are evil, not because you are uniquely obedient, not because you are weak, because the agentic state is not a character flaw. It is a feature of how human minds respond to perceived legitimate authority. It is older than ethics. But here is what Milgram actually left us with. Not a verdict on human nature, a map of the mechanism. Once you know the agentic state exists, once you can name it, recognize it, feel it activating, you can stop and ask, whose responsibility is this actually? Am I pressing this switch because it is right? Or because someone in a position of authority told me to? And you can be the person in the room who says no. Milgram wrote, the disappearance of a sense of responsibility is the most far-reaching consequence of submission to authority. You are not in the 65% because you are evil. You are in it because you are human. The only way out is knowing you are in it.